Everyone's queuing for coffee 50 yards that way, and there's an entirely unutilised, rather good coffee, independent coffee vendor sitting right there.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to this Onward panel event. I think we're going to get going. My name is Gavin Rice, and I am the project director for Onward's Future of Conservatism project here at the Onward think tank. Very warm welcome to all of you for being here, and a very big welcome to our guests that we have on our panel with us here today. So just by way of brief introductions, on my left, I'm joined by the Right Honourable Jessie Norman, Member of Parliament for Hereford and South Herefordshire, one of the leading intellects within the Conservative Party and tradition. She's briefly served in a number of ministerial positions, including as Minister of State for Decarbonisation Technology and as Financial Secretary to the Treasury. Has written on the subjects of conservatism widely. Has just published an essay on real conservatism jointly with Onward, which you can find on the Onward website and online. It's an excellent piece of work, and I strongly recommend that you go and read it at this crucial time where the intellectual energy of conservatism is in need of rebuilding and restating more than ever. To his left, we have Matt Leach, who is the Chief Executive of Local Trust, where he oversees all of the operations, leading the staff team and working with the board on strategy and governance. He was formerly the CEO of HACT, which is the Social Housing Sector's Ideas and Innovation Agency. To my right, I'm joined by Councillor Elizabeth Campbell, who is the leader of the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea Council, where she was elected in 2017 and has served as councillor since 2006. And then to her right, I'm joined by Andrea O'Brien, the Director of Policy and Impact at Demos. So very warm welcome to our panel. The way this is going to run is that we'll have some introductory remarks by each speaker for approximately 5 minutes. I will then share a little bit of discussion, and then we will move after that to audience Q&A, and we'll have lovely Onward people going around with microphones for those of you that want to ask questions. So if you do have a question, when we come to questions, just put up your hand. You'll have a microphone brought over to you. Please wait until you've got the microphone before you ask your question. Prior to asking your question, please give your name and organisation if you have one. And the very, very, very strict Onward House rule is that these are questions, not statements. So please frame what you have to say in terms of a question and keep it nice and short so we can get through as many people as possible. So the theme we are discussing today is the relationship between conservatism, especially the future of conservative thinking and policy, and place, community, localism, the social fabric, civic pride, and neighbourhoods. I'm going to start by coming to Jessie on my left, who, as I said, has written about this a lot. Jessie, obviously the party is now very much out of power and is in, in case we haven't all noticed, is in rethinking, reshaping, rebuilding mode. Place was a really important element of what you might call the sort of Boris Johnson agenda in 2019, or the agenda that was around him, of which he was the figurehead, and levelling up was one of the key pledges of the 2019 manifesto. Frustrations about inability to deliver on all of those promises has been one of the major factors behind the electorate's decision to say thanks but no thanks at the last election. How do you see the party and conservatism rebuilding its credibility on this question of localism and place?
Well, I would say that thanks but no thanks is an extremely gentle way of describing the electorate's reaction to the Conservative Party at the last general election. But it's very nice that you put it that way. I should say that I have in the front row, directly in front of me, a phalanx of Herefordians who will be goggle-eyed with astonishment at the stupid things I say, or ready to rush the stage if I say anything really crass. So if that happens, I'm just giving you the heads up, ladies and gentlemen, so you all know. It's not that MPs travel everywhere with the kind of clacks, but I have to say it's quite nice. I like it. Okay, so a couple of things. Where to begin? I mean, this essay I've just published with Onward takes as one of its kind of founding points the idea that we should have to try to revisit what the basis of conservatism actually is. And one of the nice ways in, I think there are two really nice definitions of conservatism that I just want to start with, if I may. The first is that a conservative is someone who thinks that institutions are wiser than individuals. Okay? I think that's the first thing. So institutions, these might be institutions of local government, but broadly speaking, as ways of trapping human experience over time, sort of evolving through time, earning their keep through their value to a particular community or a society. And I think that's quite a useful way of thinking about it. So it's simultaneously a warning against individual arrogance and presumptuousness, and a reminder that actually there's a lot of knowledge in our institutions that we ought to try to find a way of liberating and freeing. The second idea is that a conservative is someone who knows the new stuff is better than the old stuff, but prefers the old stuff. And I also quite like that. And that, to me, encodes something about the kind of reality of the environment that we grow up in and what we find exciting and liberating about that. And in many cases, those are the kinds of instincts that sit behind what used to be incredible traditions of civic pride in this country. I mean, the 19th century, as you know, is not just a century of muscular Christianity and the idea that people can essentially be kind of called to a sense of public service and duty, and that great institutions such as Manchester Grammar School, at which the great Michael Crick was educated to my left, can grow up and exist in order to support the growth and development of these people from all walks of society, but also that those people should then go and play their part on the big stage. And I think we've rather lost that. And we've lost it through a whole series of different reasons. One reason is successive government decisions to withdraw power and money away from local authorities, which I think has damaged them significantly. I think in the you can go a long way back. You can go back to Local Government Act, I guess 1962, whatever it is, or 1982. I guess you've got the most recent example would be the decision by the Cameron government to continue to kind of push on local authority funding 2013 to 15. Anyway, there's a lot of evidence of that. And that, of course, is a terrible mistake, because if Conservatives believe one thing, it is you have to give people responsibility, and then you get a response over time. You don't get it immediately, but you get a response where people who want responsibility, people who want to take a degree of influence and to show what they can do in their own communities, then step forward. So I think that has been a serious problem. If you read a book, which I thoroughly commend to you, after you've finished breathlessly on the last page of my essay on real conservatism, you might want to turn to a book by Paul Collier called Left Behind. And one of the things that does is to show how extremely badly we have been served by our very centralized fiscal system, which is simultaneously superscale for the nation and subscale for local government. And that has the effect that enormous levels of regional inequality have built up over the last 30 years. And they've been ratified by a kind of Treasury mumbo-jumbo. I say this as a former Treasury Minister, and who knows the institution extremely well. But there's some Treasury mumbo-jumbo which says, look, we cannot make decisions that are substantive interventions in market activity. Markets will clear, and if people want to move around the country, then they can do so in order to meet market needs. That turns out to be hopelessly mistaken, because the people who move are the people who can move, and the people who don't move are the people who can't move. And there's an enormous waste of talent and energy in the people who can't move. So we've got to find a way of getting Muhammad to go to the mountain, and the mountain to be welcoming and embracing of the younger members of the Muhammad family, if we're going to get a proper development of the kind of talent that we're missing. So that all fits into a picture, I would say. Final thing, no sane person thinks we can have a sensible levelling up policy in this country which does not have higher education, further education at its heart, because you have to have skills. Now, we're actually quite good at educating the kind of elite higher education. We then have a rump underneath that where we're doing less well. We're really quite bad at further education, but beyond the sixth form college level. Which is to say there aren't fantastic institutions there. It's just nothing like enough of them. As a country, we woefully fall short of people who need to get skills up to kind of level 3, level 4. And we're terribly bad at making sure that those skills are widespread and properly, as it were, accessible to people across the country. So that's an agenda for us. In Herefordshire, we have set up a new university It sits between a higher education institution and a further education institution. It's a specialist technical university. Very vocational in aspiration, but you end up with a master's in engineering. The first graduates of that university have gone to BAE, graduated in September, BAE, Mondelez, Kier Construction, Balfour Beatty, Atomic Weapons Establishment. These are kids. Well, one kid turned down a job at JCB just the other day to go and run an ag fruit picking, mechanized fruit picking project in Cambridgeshire. He was a farmhand 3 years ago. That's the future. That's what we need to do as a country. We need to find ways of fixing and building skills in areas at the end of the line, and we need to reverse the talent drain from rural areas through cities and into London. And if we do that, then nothing can stop us. Thank you very much.
Jesse, thank you very much indeed. Now, if I may, I will turn to you, Matt. One of the most important aspects of reviving localism, reviving community and rejuvenation is the subject of housing. There is nothing more important to most people than the house in which they live alongside their family in most cases. From your experience leading local trust and your wider career, how do you see the significance of and the challenges and the opportunities around housing, around neighbourhoods, the places that people live?
I think it's the places that people live that are important, and what's around them and what makes up community. And as Jesse said, the institutions that provide identity and connection and sustainment within them, that's much more important than the houses themselves. And I know on the last panel you were on, Gavin, there was a little bit of a tiff between Michael Gove and Danny Kruger over what happened in 1850. But if I can just go back to 2018, Local Trust did some work looking to some data mapping, and we looked to map social infrastructure, the kind of places to meet, civic organisations, accessibility of state service-based institutions, down to an LSOA level right across the country. And we ended up with this massive map of the sort of scaffolding for social capital, the stuff that connects people together. And so what you do when you've got lots of data is you start to see whether it correlates with anything. And one of the interesting things we saw immediately was that if you mapped it against the Brexit vote, you found that it was 3 times more correlated with the Brexit vote than economic factors, which suggests there was some sort of social factor going on there. So this felt kind of like something that was quite useful. So we went ahead, we developed the methodology, we started to look at the relationship between that and deprivation, and we found that actually when you overlaid deprivation indices over whether there was social fabric in a place, you ended up with a list of about 250 places, about 2.5 million people live in them, where outcomes are just profoundly worse than anywhere else. Lower education, much worse health, much more serious crime. If you picked any key social indicators, these places were doing worse. But interestingly, when you stuck them up on a map, you ended up with something that, before the 2019 elections, it turned out looked remarkably like the Red Wall. And in fact, the maps we created were remarkably predictive. Over 60% of the 2019 gains of the Conservative Party were in constituencies that had one or more of these areas that were both economically deprived, but critically weren't just economically deprived, had seen the stripping out of their social fabric. Often it's the peripheral estates on the edge of post-industrial northern towns that lost the shared workplace, the trade unions, the working men's clubs, the pubs, all the stuff that gave them their identity. And sure, we'd come in with social benefits, we'd come in with social care, but we hadn't done anything to replace the social fabric that had away. And you can see a similar pattern in the most recent election. Actually, the places where reform rose most was exactly the same places. And when people talk about the forces driving political change in this country, and people talk about Europe, or they talk about immigration, they talk about the economy, I think actually what the factor that's missing is this thing around social glue, the fact that the places that feel most disenfranchised, that are lurching from one side to another, from one answer to another, seeking a solution to their problem, are overwhelmingly the places which have suffered from both social neglect and economic neglect. I've seen the stripping out of the institutions that Jesse rightly identifies. And I think it's because of a sort of sense of loss around what used to be society. People knew what they were, they knew where they were. It gave them purpose, connection, a sense of reciprocal self-obligation. They looked after themselves. The fabric that held us together provided identity and connection, built social capital, disappeared. People feel a sense of loss. They feel a sense of betrayal and anger. They can't quite put their finger on it, so they look for answers. And I think if you go back 30 or 40 more years, actually this was something that was understood by both parties. So if you look at the city programmes from Michael Heseltine, John Gummer's single regeneration budget, the Labour Party's New Deal for Communities, they had wider ambitions, but actually at the heart of all of them was an attempt to fix the social, the community bit of places, not just the economic side of things. But we've seen that from both parties. It's been largely ignored for a decade and a half. And I'd suggest that if we're to try to move on from this sense of betrayal on the periphery, from the propensity of places to switch from one extreme to another, if any government wants to both take power and then retain it, it needs to have a plan for addressing that once it gets into power. It may not win elections, but I think it will help sustain a government once it's there. And I think big society, Danny mentioned it, I know Jesse was at the heart of it. I think it had a bit of it there, but very sadly, because it was lost and never developed quickly, what we saw instead was the proliferation of policies that emerged from that: neighbourhood rights, community ownership funds, 200 or so million pounds of that spent by the last government. But it was untargeted and shorn from any sense of what it was for. And so, of course, pointy-elbowed middle-class areas rushed in and took advantage of that. People from places which had loads and loads of social fabric, and the places that felt truly disenfranchised got none of that. If anything, that kind of, you got another hidden axis of inequality, which wasn't economic, but it was social, and we've seen our politics in part pay the price of that. And just to conclude, to be fair, I think Michael Gove in particular, amongst ministers in the last government, understood that deeply, and the Levelling Up White Paper highlighted the importance of social capital as a building block for local economies, but also as a support for local society. But what we saw when it made its way through, through clearance processes in government is, bluntly, the Treasury excised all the useful policies from it. What we were left with was this rather nebulous commitment to a community spaces and places plan that in actual fact 2 years on never ever saw the light of day. And I think what must be frustrating for Conservatives, particularly those, I think some of you may have come to, 3-4 years ago, the launch by Michael Gove of the social conservatism manifesto, in fact co-authored by Andrew at the other end of the table, is that there are plenty of people within this party who I think understand that, who understand the importance of institutions, that where they don't exist, society suffers. They understand that trust in local institutions helps build broader societal trust, which then is important to a sense of legitimacy for all the rest of our institutions, our national institutions, government and beyond. And I guess alongside that, we need to recognise that where social capital is at its weakest, we've seen from the stats that it brings with it social costs, which then fall on the state to pick up in terms of educational failure, health, crime, all of which stand in the way of any ambitions to rein back the size of the state. So I think by ignoring neighbourhood, by ignoring social capital, by not embracing the local, both this party and actually arguably others have put themselves in a difficult position. There needs to be a new agenda. It may not be the agenda that wins you the election, but it's the agenda that will keep you in power if you get it right going forward. I think finally just to note that the new bunch of ministers who've come into MHCLG have just asked Hilary Armstrong, a former minister, to kick off a review of neighbourhoods policy, which suggests that some of them at least get that. I think in parallel there's probably a lot of space for the Conservative Party to have a go at that as well.
Thank you very much, Matt. Elizabeth, I'll come to you next. You've had a rather distinguished career in local government as a local politician. What challenges do you see from a local government perspective about how we deal with rejuvenating neighbourhoods? How do we deal with making the places where people live better? What are the challenges? What have we not got right? And what do we need to be doing? What do we need to be doing differently?
Okay, I suppose I start with from where I am, where I belong, which is Kensington and Chelsea. And I was just thinking about what Jessie said about institutions are wiser than the individuals. What I'd say in KNC, I think people feel exactly the opposite. We've had a complete breakdown of trust of anything to do with the state and institutions. And we're having to rebuild that very slowly, step by step. And it's public trust which has broken down, not just in recent memory, but across generations. So from clearances in the 1960s to race riots in the 1980s to more recently Grenfell. And when you're talking about rebuilding public trust, and I think where you begin is probably visibility. You need to be really visible as a leader and as local councillors. You've got to be seen on the ground. And you've got to take time to listen properly, however difficult the conversations may be. And certainly in our case, the conversations quite often are, in the modern euphemistic term, very, very challenging. And I think the third thing we have to be is totally honest with people. That you've got to say what you can do and what you can't do, what you can manage to conjure up and what is actually impossible. And we've been really helped by that by signing the Hillsborough Charter. So we're the first institution in the country which has said that, and you wouldn't believe that we actually need to say it, that you need to be honest and you have, you need to approach everything with candor. And it has completely transformed how we engage with our communities. And to go to what Matt was saying about housing and things like that. So for us, one of the ways of restoring trust was to bring our housing stock back under control. And we're always thinking in terms of, okay, place and civic pride. Well, the first thing, as you said, Matt, it's where you live. Does your roof leak? Do the windows leak? Is the heat disappearing out the window? Have you got a decent, affordable home? And secondly, have you got a home? Because, frankly, in London, 1 in 50 Londoners are homeless now. And that's one child in every primary school class in London doesn't have a permanent home. So somewhere in that conservatism has to be, you've got to have somewhere to live. Let's start with the basics. And once you've got somewhere to live, then, Matt, we can talk about building communities. But you can't build a community if you're homeless and you're in a B&B somewhere in London. And certainly, we in KNC have really seen this whole thing about building communities and building homes. So we've committed to spending £600 million making sure that our current homes are up to scratch. And then we have a program of building affordable homes. And I'm very pleased to see my deputy leader in the back because he's been responsible for us winning Best Affordable Homes under £20 million for 2 years running. And that's where you build communities as well. So our one that we opened this week is opposite the mosque. It has 32 homes in it, 20 of which are truly affordable, but one front door, so it's completely tenure blind. The mosque is going to operate a primary school, I believe, in the community centre at the base. Not primary school, sorry, nursery. And of course, the children will come from everywhere. You don't have to be a Muslim to attend. And I think it's that, isn't it? It's having places where you meet people, where you have common ground. And that could be actually maintaining your parks, so they're very beautiful, ensuring there are libraries where people can go to, or for us in Kensington and Chelsea, beautiful public spaces. I think that still really matters. But for many councils, they simply can't afford to do that any longer because so much of our money is diverted towards adult social care, children's. We have a child in Kensington and Chelsea who's costing us £16,000 a week. That's a lot of money. And, you know, adult social care, children's, and in London, it's homelessness. I mean, whoa, we're £4 million over our budget in the first quarter. Other London boroughs like 16 million, 13 million. It's completely unsustainable to create beautiful places for people to live, wonderful new homes, etc. If you don't have the money to actually put, you know, to start. So, yeah, I would say, number one, you've got to have public trust. You've got to do things with people, and they have to have a say in what their communities look like. And number two, let's get back to the basics. First of all, you need to have somewhere to live before you can have the community.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'm going to come to you now, Andrew. Mm-hmm. So you're currently at Demos, but you were previously at Social Enterprise UK, and we're thinking about questions of how to create a better business sector, and questions around the relationship between business, the market, and the state. What do you think is the role of business and the private sector in all of this?
I think it's got a very important role. I think, coming back to what Jessie said at the beginning about institutions, I think the Conservative Party has sort of lost its way when it comes to thinking through its philosophical foundations. You know, I think liberalism, socialism, other ideologies have tended to become quite mono-institutional. Either the market or the state are the key kind of determinants. And conservatism at its best has always believed in a rich tapestry of institutions, whether there's faith groups, charity, social enterprise, other forms of business cooperativism, which I know obviously Jessie. Briefly, the Conservative Cooperative Network, which you were leading as well. You know, we recognise that the market doesn't always provide the best mechanism to enable, you know, the right outcomes to emerge. And ultimately, what is conservatism? It is a belief, as Jessie said, about the kind of wisdom of those institutions over time, but it's also about preserving a way of life as well. You know, we need more than just simply a good job and a good home. We need to feel belonging to something, and that culture is fostered at a local level. It's the, you know, places where you interact with your neighbours. It's your sporting institutions. It's your faith groups. It's churches or mosques, whatever they happen to be. And I think the Conservative Party has lost touch with that, and in some cases we've become hostile to it, I think. And I think that comes down to sometimes a kind of instrumentalism which has emerged, which I go to far too many Conservative events where they talk about communities, and it's like, oh yes, of course it leads to better job outcomes, or, you know, can we boost GDP by a certain amount? Well, there's something even more fundamental than that, which is just, this is what being British, what being English is. It's having a rich and kind of access to a rich set of institutions at your local level, and we have as a party overseen, alongside Labour when it was in government as well, but a decimation of local institutions, your pubs, your post offices, your banks, your community centres. You know, I'll come to an example of one area which I think shows some of that lack of thinking, but later on. But you know, we've overseen that. I think that the challenge for Conservatives is that, you know, we are an organic party. We love things to come from the bottom up. You know, we want people to be able to come together and to empower themselves and to build those institutions. And I think there's a lot more we can do to help that. And we can support philanthropy, we can support charities to help do that, and social enterprise models to do some of that. But the state's also got to get its hands dirty as well. I think Matt made a really good point about looking at those left behind areas, which map so well in terms of lack of social infrastructure. You can't just say to these places, well, here you go, you know, you need social infrastructure, go off and deliver it. It's not possible. The state needs to become an enabler through the financial resource it has, but also connecting up other parts of the public sector, whether that's local governments or the NHS or other institutions, to really, you know, we need a new great foundation of community-led and community-run institutions. And we can't crush those by directing those purely in terms of whatever the state wants to do at one moment in time. I mean, God, I mean, if they had to respond to the last Conservative government, they'd have had, you know, 5 or 6 different objectives over the course of 10 years about what they should be doing. The point I think that Conservatives have always understood is that you've got to let go and let these institutions represent those local areas. And you might not always agree with what they do, and you might think, for example, if you're interested in tackling obesity, for example, oh, why are they putting on a rumba class in this particular village hall? Why are we subsidising this activity? But that's what communities do. They find the best ways often to tackle the most deep-rooted social and economic challenges that we face. And the state has to, endow, support those organisations, but not crush them under its own political imperatives. So I think the Conservative Party has a lot to kind of pick up on that. And I suppose another challenge that we face as well is this increasing kind of economism which has taken over the party as well. I read a great book by a precocious academic who was becoming an MP back in 2009-10 called Jesse Norman, called The Big Society, where he talked about the kind of dominance of kind of homo economicus and thinking in the Conservative Party. And far too often, and I think Shaw Start's a great example of that, which we've basically recreated at the end of our time in government via family hubs. But, we could have transferred those assets back into the community if we'd been patient enough to do so. But unfortunately, as Jesse said, kind of Treasury brain took over, and it was just decided to, en masse, remove an institution which was doing some good work in many communities around the country. And we need to tackle that kind of fundamental philosophical challenge. You can't pursue conservative ideology and conservative ideas if you're beholden to a kind of very narrow form of economic thinking. And coming back to the other big challenge which leadership contends has been talking about in terms of getting the economy growing again, Conservatives need to be quite clear that there is no route to economic growth that doesn't have strong communities and that social glue which Matt was talking about at the absolute heart of it. It's no surprise to me that as we've seen concerns raised about the fracturing in our communities, our growth has slowed down, investment has slowed down. We did a paper together, as Matt mentioned, which Michael Gove launched, called Social Capitalism, and the evidence is very clear that countries which have high levels of social cohesion have high levels of investment, high levels of growth, high levels of GDP. The market can't necessarily build those institutions. That's why I think the state and philanthropy and civil society has a key role to play. But they are fundamental to all the economic challenges that we face. So I guess my plea for the Conservatives would be to rediscover the power of those institutions, to recognise that we can't just stand there because we have a phobia about state action and sort of hope that they're going to emerge. We've got to really roll our sleeves up and develop policies that can help that. And we have to let communities themselves determine and run those at a local level and not try to compartmentalise and instrumentalise them. And we need to recognise that what a good conservative kind of vision for society looks like is one in which you have a flourishing of civil society, working in collaboration with the private sector in many cases, but where the form and function of those institutions will be so diverse that it won't be possible to kind of put a schema on top of them. But you'll know it when you feel it. And I think what we all feel in this room, and I think a lot of us feel after 14 years in government, is we've left our communities probably in a weaker position than they were when we entered government, and that must be one of our biggest failures. And if we are in opposition, we have to find new policies and new energy to do that. And otherwise, there's no point of the Conservative Party, I would say.
Matt, thank you very much. And I'm very glad that you mentioned Treasury brain, because I've actually written it down in my notes as a question to put back to Jesse. Jesse, you were in the Treasury for a period, and one of the themes that's coming out of this discussion is that there's got to be a symbiotic relationship between a thriving economy, including thriving local economies, and a thriving social fabric and civil society. And a lot of the work that Onward has done on the social fabric has shown that it's often the most materially deprived communities that have the worst outcomes socially in terms of civic engagement and family breakdown and all the rest. Thinking about the levers here, the policy levers, is there a problem with the centralisation in terms of economic policy? Is there a problem with the way that the Treasury operates? How can we change our policy approach to the economics of this to create the kinds of communities and societies that we're talking about now?
Okay, wow, where to begin? Huge topic. Let's just say a few things. So I was the financial secretary. That's on the tax side rather than the spending side. In my view, I don't think the tax side of the Treasury is enormously functional, but it's better than the spending side. And I tried to, I actually reviewed Howard Davis's not very good book on the Treasury about 18 months ago in the Financial Times. And one of the things I suggested was that they should have the equivalent of a kind of credit committee on the spending side, which is basically people who know what it is to spend money and to make investments over a period of time. And just say to them, for any investment program over 50 million quid or something, do you think it's a sensible idea? And just put it through the ringer. And what you would find is that lots of things that didn't look sensible would go through because these people know what it is to be building capacity in many cases, because they do it in the private sector. And of course, no one's suggesting these are exactly analogous, but they'll have a sense of it. And many things that were obviously rubbish wouldn't go through, like HS2. It's a classic example. I mean, I having more or less run the process that stopped the Cameron government from electing a House of Lords in 2012, I was quite prepared to run the same operation to stop them doing HS2. But I was cut out by Ed Balls, because Ed Balls decided to bring the Labour Party in favour of the government. So then, of course, it becomes a suicide squad to attempt to oppose that in Parliament, and so that was one of the reasons why I didn't. And I've always regretted it in some respects, because that was a catastrophic decision, and you could see it was a catastrophic decision. Just very quickly to come to the point, there's mindset, and then there are policies and decisions. So let's just take some examples. Mindset, we've talked about over-centralisation. The Treasury knows that skills are more important to the local economic growth than infrastructure. But skills get funded out of current spending. We haven't developed an intellectual mechanism for funding skills out of capital spending, and therefore they constantly look like a drain on our DEL for resource annual spend for departments. That's a serious problem. That always gives you a bias against running spend, and therefore against skills. Another example is decisions. So a sane Treasury, in my view, would not have allowed the corporatisation of savings banks in Britain, building societies. They were very valuable ways of trapping capital locally. I'm not at all persuaded that the 1992 Higher Education Act was a very smart idea. Right? Took an enormous number of polytechnics, which had where the word polytechnic was a bad name, but many of what they did was fantastic. Right? They had local catchments. They were not competing for foreign students. They were not competing for national students. They were trying to build capacity and capability in their local cities. At the moment, we have a bizarre situation in which higher education is sucking talent out of the rural areas, running it through cities, and then basically sending it to London, by and large. And that's sucking talent out of areas that are badly left behind, just when you want to be building those skills back up. So I'm worried about that. I'll give you another example, banks. Banking policy in Britain over the last 50 or 60 years has been basically to have national champions rather than to have locally grounded organisations. In our banking system in the 19th century, Martins was a bank that existed in East Anglia. That was the nature of the bank. And banks constantly went bust, and basically over time it became clear that that the national mood or the government mood was not to have banks going bust. And so they got conglomeratized and merged into bigger and bigger banks with greater and greater international catchments. This didn't happen in Germany. Now in Germany, you have banks that periodically go bust, the Credit Anstalt in Austria, etc. But basically they fix capital locally. And that, sorry, Elizabeth's quite right, I should be shutting up. But that is just another example of where I think bad policy making leads to a loss of local capital and capability. I'm so sorry.
Gavin, can I quickly come in on that?
No, I shouldn't.
Just
yes.
Just very
Sorry, you
quick
got me on my pet topic.
Not at all.
I mean, I think the other problem with the Treasury side of things as well is, I mean, evidence-based policy making is very important, and I think the work local trust has done in many institutions in this room. We all spend an enormous amount of time creating evidence to give to Treasury. However, I also think there is to persuade for the case for investment and the case for reforms in key areas. But I think there's also a role for politicians as well, and the Conservative Party in particular in this case, to just use a bit of common sense in that as well. I mean, I grew up in Kensington and Chelsea, actually. I grew up in North Kensington, and I can see the difference between North and South Kensington, just walking down the road. And I know the institutions that make South Kensington such a vibrant area, strong cultural institutions, wonderful independent shops, pubs, restaurants, beautiful places to live. It doesn't take a rocket science to realise that the thing that's lacking in a lot of the areas that Matt was mentioning in terms of Red Wall lack those institutions. You don't need a business case to prove that. In fact, sometimes it's almost impossible because it's counterfactual of trying to prove how that would work. But recognising that the role of the state is to provide the resources for those foundational institutions for local places and to take a long-term patient approach. We need to stop trying to sort of prove the obvious all the time, I think, and then that just further erodes both people's patience with the system, but also leads to some of the perverse outcomes that Jesse was talking about, where you have things which are so obviously not necessarily value for money, but can structure the evidence in the right way, can get through, and yet the very foundational institutions of local communities we're talking about here, which we all in this room know are so important, never seem to make the cut. And similarly on the tax policy side as well, you sometimes, there are reforms, I remember arguing until I was blue in the face about reforms to gift aid, for example, which we knew could unlock hundreds of millions of pounds for local organisations. But the business case could never be made. But here we are in this room now still talking about how we need to do more to boost local philanthropy, more to boost local giving. And yet we turn down the very options that could do that. So we've got to not just, yes, Treasury brain is a problem, but it's also a political problem. We just haven't stood up to that that Treasury brain and told those institutions that actually, yes, we need to spend wisely, as Jesse said, and not waste money, but also in terms of making the case for something. We know as Conservatives what we want society to look like and the future to look like. Just bloody put the money into it. That's the key. So, yes.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the subject of third spaces, because again, that's something which lots of data shows has been in decline, particularly in the most deprived communities. Elizabeth, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, I was just thinking about what you were saying about decisions at local level. And I would say the no-brainer for me is devolution for London. I mean, you've got trailblazers in the West Midlands, you've got trailblazers in Manchester, they've got one lump of settlement over 10 years. We haven't got that. I mean, and from the point of view of growth in London, we'd have a much better idea of, how to promote growth, how to keep economic growth. If we could keep a little bit more for ourselves, we would definitely be incentivized more. I think on housing, you build more housing near where the job market is, and thirdly on infrastructure. So one of the political decisions we could make, but we're in opposition now, of course, I've forgotten that, but is this whole thing about devolution.
Yeah. I'm keen to come to some questions, but just briefly before I do, Matt, we've talked a lot about some of the conversations circling around spending, and obviously the reality is that for the foreseeable future, the fiscal picture at a macro national scale is going to be quite bleak. From your perspective, in terms of rejuvenating local neighbourhoods and communities, is it just a question of spending more money?
I think there are two answers. I think the first is, can we afford not to spend money on particularly rebuilding the social fabric of those places in the periphery that have seen so much ripped out? Because there's a huge amount of evidence out there, for example, that the propensity of a family to break down and for a child to go into care is directly related to the amount of social relationships that a family has around it. Local institutions provide normalizing forces. They spread social norms. They create order. There's people there who can help out when people are in trouble, so that they don't tip over to the point where the only people who can save them are the social workers and the state. And Elizabeth, as you said, as soon as you do that, you can just start calculating your deficit. I was talking to a leader of a Northern Council who pretty much said that her entire budget black hole is down to social care, and they're seriously thinking about how they address that. I think alongside that, there's a kind of question around actually what is it that people want from the state, and what do they expect from their lives. If I'm allowed to mention a different right of centre think tank, some excellent work done at the American Enterprise Institute, looking at what makes people feel they live somewhere that's normal. And I think that's actually, most people just want to live normal lives. They don't want to have heroic lives. They want to feel normal. And they crunched through their American survey, life survey data, and they found that overwhelmingly the biggest driver of people feeling they live somewhere normal is being able to go somewhere near their house where they recognise people and those people recognise them. And it's the stabilising forces of those micro institutions which help society stay stable itself and provides in time, hopefully, the freedom for local authorities to do stuff they want to do rather than stuff they can't avoid having to pick up the pieces from.
And the foundation of economic growth as well. I mean, there is no growth without that.
Well, the Levelling Up white paper was bang on when it said social capital is one of the 6 pillars of economic growth. You're not going to set up a small business as on an estate where vans get broken into every night and tools get nicked. You need levels of trust to rebuild local economies, particularly those that have been shattered by all sorts of forces over the last 30 or 40 years.
And another thing that came out from our social capitalism paper we did as well was, again, so the Conservatives under the last government were going to spend 600 billion on capital investment over a 5-year period. If we'd have put 1% of that into social infrastructure, that would have been transformational across different areas. And I think as the work the local trust has shown and commissioned has shown as well, the returns on that social infrastructure is quicker, actually, than the physical infrastructure that we seem to be obsessed with as well. I mean, I'm not against road, railways, housing, estates, etc. All these things need to be built, but those foundational social infrastructure, as Matt said, underpins economic objectives, social objectives, but actually the kind of net savings and return to Treasury are much quicker. It's just that we've lacked the confidence, it seems. It is a mindset thing, I think, as Jesse said. There's a sort of lack of confidence in the ability of the state to support the development of that social infrastructure. And it doesn't mean spending more money. It means spending the money we're currently already spending just better and allocating it better, I think.
To be fair, Jesse was sent to the wrong bit of Treasury because you were writing books about this before you became a minister.
I'm going to come to questions now, so I'd like to take a couple. So I'll take these in twos. Could people on the mics be going around? So if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand or take them in pairs and then hand them on to the panel. And the quicker the questions and answers...
Conspicuous troublemaker in the front here, I'm afraid.
Is there's a plant over here? The quicker the questions and the more succinct the answers, the more we can get through. So the lady here and then the lady at the back.
Thank you. I was very struck that you actually started the meeting by saying the Conservatives are out of power. And as a Conservative councillor, I can tell you that's not entirely true.
Yeah.
I think that perhaps some of this conversation needs to sit around the relationship between local authorities, particularly Conservative local authorities, as the arm to action. And that too long the Parliamentary Party has been like Smaug, kind of hoarding all the thoughts and incentives. So how do we improve that relationship and make it work better and deliver for our communities? Thank you.
Thank you. And at the back.
Yes, hello. Claire Hayward, I'm the chair of the Convention of the North. So conscious, Andrew, that you just mentioned, you can see the difference between the north and south of Kensington. Perhaps you should travel to Blackpool. At the moment, we are really suffering from lack of investment in the north. HS2 probably being one of the biggest negative decisions that have been made, and we are really struggling to get local communities to be able to access jobs. It's basic. If you live in the south, you won't understand it. What's your view on how do we ensure that, one, we are focusing in on the health discrepancies between the north and the south, which are really significant, the lack of investment in infrastructure in the north, which would make a huge difference to populations, which would then have huge impact on economic growth. So I'm just very conscious. I don't know if... is all the panel in the south, or do any of you live in the north?
I've worked with the community in Blackpool Revo.
Okay.
So I know, it's one of the toughest places. You go there, a few months apart, and you find that a building has simply disappeared. It's quite something. What's very obvious there is that it's not just an economic turnaround that's needed. There's a deep social turnaround needed, and those community organisations that exist need to be invested in because they provide desperately needed stability, don't they? In the face of problems that will only be resolved by 30 years of structural economic change. And in the meantime, what do you give them?
So on the local government point, perhaps it'd be good to go to you, Elizabeth. Do you think that, does local government need to do more? Does it need to be more empowered? Of course, we have got Conservatives, as you rightly say, in office, in local councils, but also obviously Ben Houchin up in Tees Valley as well. What's the role of local government in all this?
Well, I think the government has a huge amount of things to do and place to play. I suppose it comes back to the whole devolution stuff about how you place power down to the lowest level so that you actually understand your communities, etc. And you will know as well as me. I mean, at the moment, the money's not there, is it? I mean, so it's all very well having lovely policy, not policies, lovely ideas, etc., but the reality on the ground is councils are absolutely on their last legs. And we haven't had any, I don't think, any acknowledgement of that, whether it's from the previous Conservative government or the current Labour government. And over the last, I suppose, decade, what's been happening is that we've been given more and more and more responsibilities and less money to do it. I can see these ladies nodding in the front. And MPs have made themselves look absolutely terrific by saying, oh, yes, well, we'll do something about this or that, or councils can do that, or, you know, let me give you one example. It was great to raise a national minimum wage, but we're all picking up the pieces with all our social care stuff. So there's got to be a join up there. We just can't be the sort of the bad boys who are left to be hung out to dry, while everyone else takes the credit of being sort of more liberal and more modern, no?
We're actually working on a project at Demos at the moment looking at local government finance, and I think that's exactly it. I mean, you know, we need to move to a system where things like adult social care, children's social care, homelessness, you know, those pressures and shocks which aren't really based on the local resources that the community might have, those responsibilities are mandated centrally, they have to be funded centrally, and then you can free up local budgets so they can focus on what they're really good at, which is place shaping, building those local institutions and so on. And just coming back very quickly to your question, my family's from Warrington, so I know the area quite well, and you know, the Conservative Party, again, my worry about the election results is you could see a retreat from trying to be a national party and kind of going back to the comfort zones that we kind of occupied in previous generations. The great opportunity of 2019 was it meant the Conservative Party representing places like Blackpool and others where, you know, we could actually, you know, we had to think about and engage with those communities. And I think, you know, the next Conservative Party has to come up with, the future of the Conservative Party has to come up with a real agenda of levelling up, which exactly brings investment and jobs into those places.
We only have 5 minutes left, so I'm keen to get another couple of questions in. So the gentleman here, and I'll take the lady over there.
Cheers. Hello, my name is Will Mappleback from Core Cities UK. Hello, really interesting discussion, thank you. You've already mentioned it, but levelling up white paper, in my view, was really, really good, really thought out, and had so much to say on this particular agenda. Would you bring it back?
Will we bring levelling up white paper back? And the lady at the back there.
My name's Rebecca Young. I work at the National Council for Voluntary Organisations. So I think we know that volunteering, people giving their time for free, is such an important part of strong communities. But overall, we see a decline in formal volunteering. How can we support people to give their time?
So a question on volunteering and sort of the big society. Jesse, do you want to come in on the levelling up white paper? Should it be brought back?
Yeah, sure. So I think it's pretty clear the words levelling up have been banished from the political lexicon, but the problem of regional inequality has absolutely not been banished from it, and therefore it's essential that the new government picks up the baton. I don't think the last one did anything like enough in this area. I thought the white paper was fine. It was a bit kind of motherhood and apple pie. I would have preferred a bit more cut through, frankly, but in terms of getting the issue up the agenda, that's good. One great unheralded, I would say at least in Herefordshire, step forward from the whole agenda has been the Stronger Towns Fund. I mean, in Hereford, Stronger Towns Fund has been a huge difference. It's been very well managed. It's been very bottom up. It's pulled out a lot of community leaders who would otherwise have been lost to the body politic in the county because they wouldn't have run for the council themselves. And they've by and large done a great job for no money. And by the way, if we're thinking about people doing a great job for no money, I want to come in behind my councillor who just raised the point about local authorities who actually do have a hard budget constraint, unlike people in Westminster. And where you will find some of the best, most conservative, thrifty, long-term, kind of pragmatic policy making that you find anywhere in any form of government. On the issue of NCVO, of course I completely agree with you. I think volunteering is absolutely essential. I've been a lifelong volunteer and I've never regretted any second of that. In fact, it's been part of the foundation of what's made life so worth living for me personally, and I found that for everyone else I know. I don't think you can, the way you create volunteers is by creating opportunities for people to get involved and then allowing the habit of volunteering to grow inside them. I think that there's a little bit of scope for a bit of spending, but not very much, really. I'll give you a little example. So one thing you can do is just invest in kind of marginal benefits. So I opened last week the Community Advice Debt Money Advice Centre in in Hereford. It's kind of gone back and forth. People are constantly getting into debt. No one's got any money. You understand how the world works. It's based in Putson Baptist Church. They happen to run a parallel food parcel capability. The great thing about the CMA money is that it actually cross-funds the entity, and the entity supports the food parcels. I mean, it's just a really good example of how a little bit of money just kind of adds in that kind of institution calling into being support way, and I think that's extremely valuable. But you obviously don't want the state crowding it out. And when we talk about institutions, I don't by and large mean state institutions in the traditional sense. I mean independent institutions and private institutions and voluntary organisations. And I think those are and have always been the lifeblood of local life in Britain.
We've just got a couple of minutes left, so let's do 2 really quick questions. Please keep it super brief. At the back there, and one here.
Just listening.
You're there.
Just listening to you. So would one really simple thing be, based on everything you said, is that we should be striving to keep open pubs, post offices, creches, just, always the problem with revenue versus capital, understood. But I mean, would that be a very basic solution just for supporting?
Let me give you an idea for pubs, which is you should change local authority licensing rules to have it based on the volume of alcohol delivered. As soon as you do that, the supermarkets, instead of getting a free ride on slabs of beer, start to fund local authorities for the extra hectolitrage they're offering, and people get nudged into, by the higher prices involved, into supervised drinking in pubs. It's a total win-win. I've never managed to get government interested in it.
Very clear answer on pubs there. And the gentleman at the back.
Hello. Yeah. So first of all, I think it's great that everybody talks about housing. I can do back-to-back meetings at conference at the moment on housing. So my question is that Rob Kensington, Chelsea, we've received a housing allocation based on an algorithm to build 4,200 homes in a borough that's 50 square miles, which is more than Liverpool and more than Leeds. So my question is, should we be looking at rejuvenation rather than creation, and then focusing more on where you can build rather than demand and need?
So on how we deliver housing and housing targets, completely open. Who would like to answer on that?
I'll go on housing, because I didn't answer the question on housing before. I think clearly there is a need to build housing in at scale if we're to meet changing demographics, and it's not just about migration. There is a need for more housing. What's really important is that we don't simply build the slums and the dead dormitory towns of the future. And I think what's really important for any government or any local authority that's serious about that is that when they think about the planning, they don't just think about the hard stuff where the buildings are, but they think about grabbing some of that land value to put in place endowments to support the development and seed the development of civic life from the outset, so we create really vibrant places. You can look at things like Lichfield and the Heritage Foundation. We need to aspire to those for every new urban extension, every new town that we create. Partly because that also takes some of the pressure off local government. You create endowments that can work with local people and local government to sustain and foster community life for the foreseeable future. I think in some ways that's more important than where it is, it's how it is. If we create great communities, why wouldn't people want great communities near them?
We are at time, I'm afraid. It's been an absolutely fascinating discussion, at least I found it fascinating. Thank you very much for coming to the Onward tent. We've got a rich programme of events that will be going on throughout the rest of conference, so please do keep an eye out for the rest of our agenda. And also please do go and check out Jesse's excellent essay on real conservatism. Clearly this question of place, geography and belonging is not going anywhere for the centre-right agenda in this country, and we're going to be an important part of that discussion. Thank you once again. Will you join me in thanking our speakers?